Hello everybody, my name is Kara, and today I'm here with part 2 of my March wrap-up. As I said in my previous wrap-up, I read 20 books during the month, and I just could not talk about them all in one wrap-up, so here I'm going to do the second half. The next thing I finished was An Ideal Husband by Oscar Wilde. This is a play of his that I had never read before, and I really enjoyed it. It follows a husband and wife and how their relationship starts to suffer when a blackmailer enters the picture about some things in the husband's past that he did, and he may not be the morally upright person that his wife thought him to be when she married him, and there's a lot of side characters of course as well. I was surprised at how plot focused this play was. Also the outline sounds kind of dull, but as is Oscar Wilde, of course it's really entertaining and funny in addition to having that plot going on in the background. And I was also surprised at the number of plot twists in this play. There were a couple of things I did not see coming, and that was really exciting for me. I really loved some of the side characters. Lord Goring was hilarious. All of his interactions were so funny. Overall, I did really enjoy the play. I think this is my least favorite of the plays I've read so far, but I still give it 4.5 stars. The only reason I didn't give it a full 5 stars is because I feel like Mabel as a character was extremely underutilized. I loved her. She was so funny and just entertaining, and I just wanted to get to know her better. And she really wasn't in that many scenes. And another thing I did like is at the very end, one of the characters, it gets super sexist for 4 lines right at the very end, which I thought was weird. There's this line about how well, men's lives matter more than women's because men are more important and they do real things in the world, or something like that. And I was like, what? And you might say oh, well, it's a couple hundred years old, some of that is to be expected. But I feel his works are generally much more feminist than that. So that was surprising because I don't remember in any of the other stuff I've read from him feeling that. Next, I finished Summer of Salt by Katrina Leno. We follow our main character Georgina on the island of By the Sea, and this is a magical realism story. And there's this bird on the island that all of these bird watchers always come to observe and take notes on. And so the story starts during the summer when that happens again, and then there's this tragedy that happens on the island, and we see how people respond to that. They start to turn on each other. This is a really hard book to review because I ended up really disappointed in it, but I do think it's important. So I'll talk about the things I liked about it first. The setting and the atmosphere were done beautifully. I think the messages of this book are extremely important. I also love how casual the diversity in this book was. Georgina is a lesbian, and one of her friends, a side character, is asexual. I just loved how it was not a big deal. We hear from Georgina that her mother was incredibly supportive when she came out, and it just wasn't a big thing. And I think that's really lovely. We don't always have to have really difficult, I think, coming out stories, even though those are important. It's nice to see ones that are just more positive about it. So that was great. There were a couple of side characters I really liked. I would say that her friend Vira I enjoyed, and I think my favorite character was actually Georgina and Mary, her twin sister's mother, Penelope. I loved her. Honestly, I would love more of her backstory. So now moving into all the things that I did not think this book executed as well. I don't feel like we got to know any of the characters at all. They had no personality. I did mention that I liked Vira and Penelope, but they were really the only ones who I felt had some depth to them. And especially relationships Georgina and her twin sister Mary. We're told over and over how close their bond is, how important these two girls are to each other, and I never believed it at all. I have a brother and a sister, and I didn't feel any of their interactions, I didn't feel their sibling relationship rang true to me. It didn't seem like they cared about each other at all, but the book kept telling us that they did, and I thought that was weird. And just the characters in general, I don't feel were done very well. Especially the majority of the side characters. There is a relationship, a romantic relationship between Georgina and this girl that comes to the island, and while that was sweet, it was very surface level. And Georgina has this group of friends that we sort of see, and they had zero personality. If I remember correctly, there's one of them who's we're supposed to believe that these two girls were friends since they were really young, and her defining personality trait seems to be weed. And that's the level of characterization we got for the majority of people in this book. Like I said, we did get to know Vira a little bit better because she was her best friend, so that's something, but I just didn't feel we knew anyone in this book. And then I also really didn't like the writing in this book. It felt very stereotypical magical realism in a way that was trying way too hard. And that sounds really mean. But honestly, that's the thing that I kept thinking while I was reading this, is I was so conscious of the author trying, forcing it to sound whimsical. And I didn't feel it was natural. It felt very clunky. It felt like the author was forcing herself to write in a certain way. And of course, I don't know if that's the case, but that's really the best way I can describe it. And then another big problem I had was the way this book is set up. There's these 3 big mysteries in the book, and I knew all of them the second they were introduced, and that wouldn't have been an issue except that the book is really built on you not knowing what happened. And if you do, the whole thing feels kind of pointless. Like, I really have an issue when books that are not mysteries, like, build the whole book on being about a plot twist. It's like, this book would have been fine if you didn't have that, you know? It's like the suspense element, you could call it, came from waiting to see the other characters figure it out. If you just built it around like the atmosphere and the setting, and maybe spend more time developing the characters and things like that, because if you turn a book that's not a mystery into something that hinges on you not knowing what's going on, if you know what's going on, it's really hard to get invested in the story, at least for me, and that's what happened with this one. And like I said, I feel really bad giving this like a kind of lower rating than I wanted to, because it's a really important book. I think the messages are incredibly important, but I don't think they were executed very well, so I gave this book 3.5 stars. Next, I finished The Girl of Ink and Stars by Kieran Millwood Hargrave, and we follow our main character Isabella, and she is a cartographer, so a map maker, and that's also what she wants to do with her life. And they live on this island, and there's a governor on the island who has been sent from another country to sort of control them. And so there are all these really important themes, I think, of colonization and like the indigenous population, how they respond to that. And I thought those were handled really well. Kind of the main story of this book starts off when a friend of Isabella's goes missing, and she kind of gets swept up in the rescue mission or trying to find her. And then there's also a lot of elements about these old legends and about their island being in danger. And Isabella is one of the only people who really believes that this legend is true, and no one else really thinks it's a threat. This was unfortunately another one I was quite disappointed in. Like I said, I liked some of the messages. I did really enjoy the writing in this one. I feel like this kind of whimsical storytelling style fit a lot better with the story, and it felt a lot more natural than with Summer of Salt. So I did like that. I also really liked the world for the most part, but this is another case where I didn't feel a strong connection to the characters, and I thought the plot was actually quite boring a lot of the times. It was a lot of like trekking around the island and repairing a map. There were some reveals about things that had been happening on the island that were interesting, but like this book is only 200 and something pages, and it felt really long. Like, it took me several days to get through this, and it really shouldn't have. And then I also really didn't like the ending. There were some aspects of it that made me really uncomfortable in the way that it kind of dealt with like atonement or forgiveness and like sacrificing people for wrongs that they hadn't committed, things like that. I understand, I think, where the author was going with it, but it just kind of left a bad taste in my mouth. There's just some things that made me really uncomfortable about the way that it suggested that people could be blamed or punished or sacrificed for the wrongs that other people had committed. And while I think that that plotline can be done well, in this case it didn't feel like it was. And I gave The Girl of Ink and Stars 3 stars. Next, I finished Disenchanted, The Trials of Cinderella by Megan Morrison. This is the second book in the Time series, and it's kind of a companion sequel. The books are like connected, and I think you would get most out of them if you read them in order, but we do follow a different protagonist, and that is Ella. As you can see on the cover, she is black, and she is the Cinderella character, so it was really nice to see that kind of diversity in a retelling like this. And I just absolutely adore this book. We follow Ella as she decides that she's going to put a stop to unsafe workplace practices. So there's a lot about workers' rights and working conditions and like systemic poverty and things like that. And I think this book handled those themes really well, with a lot of compassion and realism, but also some hope. I loved all of our main characters. We kind of have like 3 main characters, although Ella is definitely the protagonist. We also follow a prince who is really like starting to realize that things about the world he lives in are worse than he thought, you know? So we really see that he has been kind of living in ignorance for a while, and we see him start to care and start to change that, and I thought his development was done really well. And Serge, her like fairy godfather type character, I love him. Also, I'm pretty sure like that him and one of the other fairy characters are going to be a thing, right? I don't know. I thought they were in this, like I thought we were going to get that in this book, and then it didn't happen, so I'm assuming that's going to happen in like later books in the series, because it's like heavily implied or hinted at. And I just love how Megan Morrison like turns some fairy tale tropes on their heads, or like really makes you think about the implications of some of these like fantasy worlds that we just kind of accept. Like really think about like kind of the working class in a fairy tale kingdom, how they would live. And I just think she handled those things so well. I love that we got some like characters who normally would have been very like stereotypical villains, and we actually saw a lot of depth to them. I don't think this is considered a spoiler, because personally this would have been a selling point of the book for me, but like Ella's step-siblings are not terrible people, and that's great. I really enjoyed that. There's also some discussion of grief and of forgiveness, and of how like you can move past blaming someone while still not like allowing them to hurt you again, or kind of like forgiving and forgetting everything they did. I thought that was really beautiful. I loved the plot and the tension, and there's like this courtroom type scene that is just brilliantly done. Just like the way that social commentary and fairy tale retelling and like character development and humor and heart and like realism and all of these things is just beautifully blended together. It just impresses me so much. I'm gushing about this book, so in case you can't tell, I gave it 5 stars. Absolutely loved it. I love the fact that Ella knits. That is super cool. And this is one of my favorite series, I think. Yeah, it was great. Next, I finished Always and Forever Lara Jean by Jenny Han. This is the 3rd book in the To All the Boys I Loved Before series, and my friend Ashley actually chose this book for me to read. And I actually really enjoyed this. I've heard very mixed things about this last book, but I thought it was done really well. We follow Lara Jean as she's getting ready to go to college and how she's making all of these really hard decisions about her future. And I thought that was done really well. A lot of criticism I've seen for this book revolves around the fact that people didn't like Lara Jean in this one. They felt like she was super manipulative. And while I can kind of see what they mean, I think that the person they're talking about, like her and her boyfriend, I think they're pretty much equally at fault, because I had a lot of issues with the way that he handled things as well. So I feel like it was realistic in the way that they both made mistakes, so that didn't bother me. I will say, I had forgotten how freaking irritating Margot and Chris are as characters. I hate them. They were in this book a lot more than the last ones, which was annoying, but aside from that, I thought this book was really well done. I really enjoyed it. I also think Jenny Han has hit on just the right amount of pop culture references. Lara Jean loves Hamilton and she mentions it a few times, but it's not over the top, and the way that her and her sisters have decided which of the Schuyler sisters they all are, I love that. That's exactly I've done that with my siblings, so it felt very real and not overdone. And just one of the things I love about Jenny Han's writing is how she gets the little things right, or if not right, she writes about little things that I really connect with personally. There's one part where Lara Jean is thinking about how her favorite memories are collections of memories. They're not a specific moment in time, but they're a bunch of repetitions of something that was really comforting to her. I don't know if I explained that well at all, but that really spoke to me on a really personal level. I really enjoyed this. I gave it 4 stars. Next, I finished Snow White, a graphic novel by Matt Fallon. This was another book that my friend Giselle picked for me, and I liked this. I didn't love it as much as I was hoping to. I feel like the setting was really a selling point for this because it's set in, is it 1920s New York City, I think? So that whole aesthetic and atmosphere, it was definitely an interesting and unusual choice for a fairy tale. So in that sense, I liked it, but it just didn't do a lot for me. And because it's a graphic novel and it's so short, I really don't feel like the characters were done that interestingly. And this is partly because I haven't read a lot of graphic novels yet, so I'm still kind of adjusting my character expectations, but as I've said with some of these other books, getting a strong emotional connection to the characters is a really important factor for me when enjoying a book. So I just feel like this one, that didn't really happen. And then the art style is obviously another big factor in enjoying a graphic novel, and I felt really torn about this one because it was definitely interesting. There were some panels I thought were just beautiful, but overall I found it to be kind of dingy, and I know that was a stylistic choice because of the setting, but I didn't like it because it made it really hard to tell what was going on sometimes. I'll try and show you an example. I can't tell what's going on here. So I don't know if that's partly because I just have not read a lot of graphic novels, and I maybe would have been more used to it if I had more experience with them, but it just made it hard to see what was going on. And if you can't really see the art, I feel like that's kind of not a good thing in graphic novels. I will say that I really liked the ending of the graphic novel and kind of how Matt Fallon changed it a little bit, or how he interpreted certain things. I thought that was really cool and clever, and also the ending had some of my favorite panels in the whole story that were just really beautiful to look at. This is one of my favorite, I think, page spreads. So a lot of mixed feelings. I ended up giving Snow White 3.75 stars. I am really glad I read it. I would still recommend it, but it's not mind-blowing for me. Next, I finished Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds. This is a novel in verse about a teenager named Will, and when his brother is killed due to gun violence, he decides that he is going to kill the person who he knows did it. And so he gets in an elevator with a gun, and every floor that the elevator stops on, another person gets on who has lost their life to gun violence, another person in his life. And that's pretty much the setup of the novel. And I thought this was brilliant. I loved the writing and the rhythm of the poetry in this book, and something I also thought was really impressive was how there were several pages where I'm like, this is one of my favorite poems, and they really did feel like poems, like separate poems that came together to fit into a story. It felt like a narrative told through poems rather than someone writing a story and then deciding they were gonna translate it into verse. Another thing I thought was really well done was how each of the characters who gets onto the elevator, they don't just represent one thing or one facet of gun violence and how it affects people. I think there was definitely a clear sort of focus for each of them, but like they still felt like fully rounded characters, even if we were only seeing them interact with Will in a very specific way. And I thought that was just so impressive, you know? Like, I think it would have been easy to make them like symbols for things, and while there definitely was a symbolic dimension to them, I do think they felt like real characters who were talking to Will. The only thing I was a little unsure on, and the reason I was trying to decide between 4.5 and 5 stars, was the ending. I wasn't incredibly satisfied with it, but after thinking about the book more, I think I was expecting something different than what Jason Reynolds was trying to achieve. For what he was trying to do, I think it's a 5-star book. So I ended up giving it 5 stars, even though like in an ideal world, I would have liked it to maybe end differently. Next, I finished The Eternity Code by Owen Colfer. This is the 3rd book in the Artemis Fowl series. I will link our live show down below because of course this is part of the Artemis Fowl read along. I really enjoyed this one. I remembered it as being one of my favorites in the series because of like the heist element of this one. There's a lot more action and like plotting in this book, which like the plotting tends to be one of my favorite things in the series. And I really loved seeing Holly and Artemis grow to like trust each other and work together. Like I just remembered it being one of my favorites. Although interestingly, I had marked it as 4 stars from the last time I read it, even though I remembered it being one of my favorites. And I think the reason, like I gave it a 4.5 stars this time. And I think the primary reason is because Pex and Chips are so freaking annoying. like some of the humor in this book got a little over the top for me, but that's definitely like personal preference. Like my friend Taylor, like that was actually one of her favorite parts of the book, so it definitely just depends on like what you're looking for in the story. I did like the humor and the characters and everything overall, but I just feel like Pex and Chips were a little bit ridiculous in how stupid they were. And I also feel like the emotional stakes weren't focused on as much. Like there are some really high stakes in this book, and I feel like we didn't always give those the time they needed, and we're instead kind of rushing on to the next like element of the plan. But overall, I still loved this book. I do think it's still going to be in my top few of the series, but I'm interested to see now what's like a new favorite Artemis Fowl book. Next, I finished The Winter's Kiss by Marie Rutkowski. This is the 3rd and final book in the Winter's Curse trilogy, Winter's trilogy. And this was kind of disappointing for me. I think considering that this book has 2 of my least favorite tropes in the world, I think I enjoyed it quite a lot. Those are amnesia and extreme miscommunication. So like I said, considering this book had those, I think I still enjoyed it quite a bit. But there were a lot of issues I had with it. I think that the characters felt completely different. And that might partly be because it's been so long since I read the 2nd book, but they felt very different to me. And Kestrel especially was like a completely different person. And while that's very understandable given the events of the 2nd book and this book, it makes sense, but like it makes it hard to connect to her, especially since I loved her character growth at the beginning of the series. It's hard to reconcile that with who she is now. It feels like I'm reading a completely different character who just happens to have the same name. So that wasn't ideal. And the same thing for Aaron, the other main character. He also felt kind of different. And while I liked him more than in the 2nd book, I still feel like this weird disconnect about like who he is. I also feel like the writing in this one got a little bit over the top. Like I really love Marie Rutkowski's writing style. And in the 1st and 2nd book, it really worked for me. I don't know if she laid it on thicker here or if maybe I just felt like it wasn't as suited to like the plot and action of this book, but it was like overly poetic and flowery and in a way that was really distracting. And then that leads me to another problem with this book for me, which was the plot itself. There were so many battles in this book. Like we were always traveling to a battle or planning a battle or fighting a battle, and like that just those like scenes just tend to really bore me in general. And I also felt like it was weird in this one because Kestrel's whole character, like the whole thing about her that I love, or one of the things I love, is that she's brilliant, but she's not really a fighter in the traditional sense. Like she's a strategist. And while it makes sense that she would, in this book, strategize some battles, it just felt like we had kind of moved away from one of the things about her character that I loved. But like I said, I did still enjoy a lot of things about this book. I love the world building and the culture, and I really feel like we have a handle on who the Valorians are and who the Harani are, and even the Dakrans, who we haven't seen as much of. I feel like Marie Rutkowski has a really clear idea of their culture and their backstory in this world, and so then the reader does too, and I thought that was done really well. I always love the way that stories and folklore are incorporated into these books, so I also enjoyed that. I absolutely loved Roshar and Sarsine. Those were 2 of my favorite characters, and they were like supporting or side characters, so I really loved. I also really liked the ending of this book. I think it was the perfect balance of bittersweet and like satisfying. Some of my favorite things about this book were seeing Kestrel's thought process and the way she plans and strategizes. Even though I didn't like all the battle stuff, I did really like seeing her figure things out and kind of like adapt to situations, and just like the whole like masterminding thing. I really love that. Like I mentioned with Artemis Fowl, like that's one of my favorite things, is seeing really smart characters do smart things. I just like that. So I ended up giving The Winter's Curse 3.5 stars. It's my least favorite in the series. The first book was actually my favorite, which seems to be a pretty unpopular opinion. I do still recommend the series overall, and if you haven't read the last book, I wouldn't say skip it. Like I'm not saying don't read the last book, it ruins everything. I just had some issues with it. Okay everybody, so that was finally all of the books that I read in March. I had a really good reading month. I'm really proud of myself. Let me know if you guys have read any of these books, what you thought of them, or if you're planning to pick them up. And let me know your most disappointing book in March, because I had a very mixed month. I had some all-time favorites and some really disappointing ones as well. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!